History and Nature. Nanny of the Maroons. Queen Nanny, Granny Nanny, or Nanny of the Maroons circa 1686, circa 1733, was an 18th-century leader of the Jamaican Maroons. She led a community of formerly enslaved Africans called the Windward Maroons. In the early 18th century, under the leadership of Nanny, the Windward Maroons fought a guerrilla war over many years against British authorities in the colony of Jamaica in what became known as the First Maroon War. Much of what is known about her comes from oral history, as little textual evidence exists. According to Maroon legend, Queen Nanny was born in what is today Ghana of the Asante. According to the oral tradition and at least one documentary source, she was never enslaved. Although widely assumed that she arrived in Jamaica as a slave, how she arrived in Jamaica is not certain. During the years of warfare, the British suffered significant losses in their encounters with the Windward Maroons of eastern Jamaica. Maroons attributed their success against the British to the successful use of supernatural powers by Nanny, but historians argue that the Maroon mastery of guerrilla warfare played a significant role in their success. Having failed to defeat them on the battlefield, the British sued for peace, signing a treaty with them on April 20, 1740. The treaty stopped the hostilities, provided for state-sanctioned freedom for the Maroons, and granted 500 acres of land to Nanny and her followers. The village built on the land grant still stands and today is called Moortown. It is also known as the New Nanny Town. Modern members of the Moortown celebrate April 20, 1740 as a holiday. In 1975, the government of Jamaica declared Nanny as their only female national hero, celebrating her success as a leader, military tactician, and strategist. Her image is also on the Jamaican $500 note, which is called a nanny in Jamaican slang. The origins of Nanny. According to Maroon legend, Nanny was born into the Akan people about 1686 in what is now Ghana, West Africa. There are several versions of her early story. It is not clear from objective sources which are accurate. In one story, she came as a free woman who may have even had her own slaves. In another, she came to Jamaica as a slave but then escaped, perhaps even jumping off of the ship while it was offshore. However, the oral traditions about her arrival in Jamaica maintain that she was always free. Another version of her life tells that she was of royal African blood and came to Jamaica as a free woman. She may have been married to a Maroon man named Ado, but had no known children who survived. Relatives of poet John Aggard claim descent from Nanny. The Jamaican Maroons. The Maroons are descendants of West Africans, mainly people from the Akan. They were known as Coromantee or Coromantee, and were considered ferocious fighters. A number of the enslaved originated from other regions of Africa, including Nigeria, the Congo, and Madagascar. However, the origin of at least half of the enslaved African people in Jamaica during the early English colonization of the island is uncertain. After being brought to Jamaica in the course of the transatlantic slave trade, many enslaved Africans fled from the oppressive conditions of plantations and formed their own communities of free black people in Jamaica in the rugged, hilly interior of the island. People who escaped from slavery joined these maroon communities in the mountains of eastern Jamaica, or the Cockpit country in the west of the island. Up to the 1650s under Spanish rule, enslaved Africans escaped and intermarried with the native islanders, the Taino or Arawak, in their communities in the Blue Mountains, Jamaica, located in Portland Parish and St. Thomas Parish, Jamaica, in the eastern end of the island. The Maroons were escaped slaves. They ran away from their Spanish-owned plantations when the British took the Caribbean island of Jamaica from Spain in 1655. Windward Maroons. In 1655, following the invasion of Jamaica, the English captured Jamaica from the Spaniards, but many Spanish slaves became free under Spanish Maroon leaders such as Juan de Bolis and Juan de Serres. The Spanish left, freeing their slaves in the process, and they joined the Windward Maroon communities. These formerly enslaved people, with their ranks enhanced with escaped and liberated slaves, became the core of the Windward Maroons. They staged a prolonged fight against English subjugation and enslavement. Later in the 17th century, more slaves escaped, joining the two main bands of Windward and Leeward Maroons. By the early 18th century, these Maroon towns were headed respectively by Nanny, who shared the leadership of the Eastern Maroons with Quayo, and Captain Cudjoe and Accompong in the west. The Windward Maroons fought the British on the east side of the island from their villages in the Blue Mountains of Portland. The community raised animals, hunted, and grew crops. Maroons at Nanny Town and similar communities survived by sending traders to the nearby market towns to exchange food for weapons and cloth. It was organized very much like a typical Asante society in Africa. From 1655 until they signed peace treaties in 1739 and 1740, these Maroons led most of the slave rebellions in Jamaica, helping to free slaves from the plantations. They raided and then damaged lands and buildings held by plantation owners. The Maroons were also known for raiding plantations for weapons and food, burning the plantations, and leading freed slaves to join their mountain communities. Nanny was highly successful at organizing plans to free slaves. During a period of 30 years, she was credited with freeing more than 1,000 slaves and helping them to resettle in the Maroon community. The First Maroon War. By 1720, Nanny and Quayo, sometimes called her brother, settled and controlled an area in the Blue Mountains. It was later given the name Nanny Town, and it had a strategic location overlooking Stony River via a 900-foot, 270 m, ridge, making a surprise attack by the British very difficult. Nanny became a folk hero among the Maroons and the slaves. While the British captured Nanny Town on more than one occasion, they were unable to hold on to it, in the wake of numerous guerrilla attacks from the Maroons. The Maroons waged a successful war against the British colonial forces over the course of a decade. When Nanny Town was abandoned, the Windward Maroons under the command of Nanny moved to New Nanny Town. Between 1728 and 1734, during the First Maroon War, Nanny Town and other Maroon settlements were frequently attacked by British colonial forces. They wanted to stop the raids and believed that the Maroons prevented settlement of the interior. According to some accounts, in 1733 many Maroons of Nanny Town traveled across the island to unite with the Leeward Maroons. In 1734, a Captain Stoddard attacked the remnants of Nanny Town, situated on one of the highest mountains in the island, via the only path available. He found it steep, rocky, and difficult, and not wide enough to admit the passage of two persons abreast. In addition to the use of the ravine, resembling what Jamaicans call a cockpit, the Maroons also used decoys to trick the British into ambushes. A few Maroons would run out into view of the British and then run in the direction of fellow Maroons who were hidden and would attack. After falling into these ambushes several times, the British retaliated. According to planter Brian Edwards, who wrote his narrative half a century later, Captain Stoddard found the huts in which the Negroes were asleep and fired upon them so briskly that many were slain in their habitations. However, recent evidence shows that the number of Windward Maroons killed by Stoddard in his attack on Nanny Town was in single digits. Military tactics. The Windward Maroons' success against a much superior and better armed enemy was a testament to the great skill their leader, Nanny, possessed. One of their advantages over the British was their long-range communications capability. They pioneered the use of a cow horn called an abang. This horn with a hole drilled in one end was used for long-range communications. Its signals allowed Maroon lookouts to communicate over great distances, and they were not understood by the British, who had no similar communications capability. Nanny's troops were masters of camouflage. The soldiers were so proficient at disguising their location that the British would circulate tales of trees in the forest becoming alive and cutting one's head off. Besides the physical aspects of camouflage, the Maroons became experts in slowing their breathing so as not to reveal their presence to someone in their vicinity. The Maroons also developed ways of creating stealthy fires that were not readily visible. The Windward Maroons were innovators in guerrilla warfare. They used surprise, the knowledge of the terrain, and cleverly chosen positions in their fight against the British. Their village was located in rugged territory with only one way in. That one way in was a narrow path that was only wide enough for one person. Soldiers trying to attack a raid in a single file were easily ambushed. To heighten the enemy's fear, Nanny's forces never killed all of the attacking forces. She would always allow a remnant to live to return to base to relay the story and horror of the encounter. Treaty. When the British signed a treaty with Cudjoe in 1739, this success allowed them to offer a less favorable treaty to the Windward Maroons. Representatives of the British governor in Jamaica signed a treaty with the Windward Maroons in 1740, between the colonial authorities and Quayo, who later became one of the leaders of Crawford's Town. This treaty between the colonial authorities and Quayo's Maroons made no mention of how much land would be allocated to Crawford's Town. As a result, a number of disputes occurred between planters and the Maroons of Crawford's Town, and later the succeeding towns of Charlestown and Scott's Hall. In response, the Assembly of Jamaica often tried to resolve the land disputes in favor of the Maroons in order to keep the peace. In addition, later that year, there was a separate land grant signed with Nanny and the Maroons of Nanny Town, which granted Nanny and the people now residing with her and their heirs a certain parcel of land containing 500 acres in the parish of Portland. This land patent consisted of 500 acres, 2.4 square kilometers, of land granted by the government to the Maroons of New Nanny Town under a separate 1740 document ending the First Maroon War. The rebuilt Nanny Town, later called Moore Town, was built on that location. In 1781, the Assembly agreed to purchase another additional 500 acres from neighboring planter Charles Douglas to increase Moore Town's communal land to 1,000 acres. The new Nanny Town Maroons, like those of Cudjoe and Quayo, agreed not to harbor new runaway slaves, but to help catch them for bounties. The Maroons were also expected to fight for the British in the case of an attack from the French or Spanish. In signing treaties with the Maroons, the British not only made a truce with a troublesome foe but also enlisted that foe in capturing runaway slaves. The colonial authorities initially recognized two Maroon towns, Crawford's Town and Cudjoe's Town, later to be renamed Trelawney Town. Eventually, there were 5 Maroon towns in the 18th century: Accompong Town, Trelawney Town, Charlestown, Scott's Hall, and Nanny Town, later Moore Town, living under their own chiefs with a British supervisor in each town. In exchange, they agreed not to harbor new runaway slaves, but to help catch them for bounties. Moore Town and Takis War. New Nanny Town was renamed Moore Town, possibly in 1760 after the governor Sir Henry Moore, 1st Baronet, during Takis War, which the Maroons helped to suppress. The first official reference to Moore Town in the colonial records was in 1760. By 1760, New Nanny Town, now known as Moore Town, was under the command of a white superintendent named Charles Swigel, and the Maroon leaders of that town, Clash and Sambo, reported to Swigel when the superintendent commanded their forces against slave rebels in Takis War. It is possible that Nanny had already died by this time. A spiritual woman, many in her community attributed Nanny's leadership skills to her Obeah powers. Obeah is an African-derived religion that is still practiced in Suriname, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Barbados, Belize and other Caribbean countries. It is associated with both good and bad magic, charms, luck, and with mysticism in general. In some Caribbean nations, aspects of Obeah have survived through synthesis with Christian symbolism and practice introduced by European colonials and slave owners. According to Maroon oral history, Nanny's success in defending her people against the colonial forces was often attributed to her mysterious supernatural powers. According to legend, Nanny had magical powers and could catch bullets and then redirect them back at the people who shot at her. Another Maroon legend claims that if any straight-haired, white man goes to the original Nanny Town, he is immediately struck dead. Death. In the Journal of the Assembly of Jamaica, 29–30 March 1733, is a citation for resolution, bravery, and fidelity awarded to loyal slaves, under the command of Captain Sambo, namely William Cuffey, who was rewarded for having fought the Maroons in the First Maroon War and who is called a very good party Negro, having killed Nanny, the rebels' old Obeah woman. These hired soldiers were known as black shots. However, it is unlikely that Cuffy killed the nanny who ran Nanny Town, since there is evidence more town was granted to her people under her leadership in 1740. Some claim that Queen Nanny lived to be an old woman, dying of natural causes in the 1760s. The exact date of her death remains a mystery. Part of the confusion is that Nanny is an honorific title, and many high-ranking women were called that in Maroon Town. However, the Maroons are adamant that there was only one Queen Nanny. According to Maroon oral history, Nanny's remains are buried at Bump Grave in Moortown. My name is Aria. Please like, share, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be the first to be notified whenever we post. You won't regret it.